This is the Baymal Podcast with Marty Solomon. I'm his co-host, Brent Billings. Today, we are with Elle Grover Fricks to address our nagging questions about the book of Joshua and its stories of mass slaughter and genocide.
Yeah, I know. Still my least favorite story. People always ask me when I travel around, all these years later, is that still the hardest story in the Bible for you? And I'm like, yep, pretty much.
Yep.
So thought about yanking it right out of the reboot and thought, well, I can't do that. That's no good. We got to keep it in here. But we got Elle with us this time around.
Woohoo. What a provocative opening. Oh, my goodness. Hard for me to sit on my hands and hear these things be said.
Goodness gracious. All right. Well, we got a lot of ground to cover, and we don't want this episode to be twice as long as it was the first time around. So I'm going to get moving. I struggle with this story, guys. I still do. Years later, I struggle with the story of the conquest. You have different stories in the book of Joshua. You've got stories like Jericho, which are, I don't know, they're built for Sunday school. They're cutesy. We walk around the town. We shout out loud. We blow our trumpets. We don't slaughter anyone, at least directly in the story. The walls fall down. We conquer Jericho. Hooray. Those ones don't keep me up at night. But then we got other stories in the book of Joshua, which pretty much feel like just stories of genocide or slaughter. They do keep me up at night. And this is one of those stories, and we've dealt with it in the original season 1 and the reboot of season 1. We've pointed out that there are stories along the way. We're not trying to avoid them or work around them, but these stories they're the exception to a much larger narrative that keeps talking about this God of grace and endless pursuit. We talked in session 1 about 1,000 to 3. I have somewhere around the time that this episode's probably published, my second book has just come out. We do a whole chapter on this idea of 1,000 to 3. A chance for Brent to put the book in the show notes. There you go.
It'll be out by the time this episode is out.
Good. Well, there's a chapter in there where we talk about 1,000 to 3. And one of the things I'm going to say here is I'm not going to upend my entire theology. I'm not going to reread the entire story of the Bible because of these handful. And there's a handful. We've talked about them. There's a handful. You got Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe we could talk about the flood. We got the Exodus and the slaughter of the firstborn of the Egyptians. We got the conquest. But these seem to be, as we learn how to read the Bible through this new lens, these are the outliers. I'm not going to reframe how I read the whole story because of the outlier stories. But that doesn't make it any easier to wrestle with or to swallow. And so I still wrestle with these stories. And we're still, even in the reboot, years later, Brent, no, we're still not going to offer a bunch of resolution. I'm not going to tie everything up with a perfect little bow and make it to where we have all the answers. We might present it in a way that feels maybe a little bit more sturdy than we did years ago, but really not a whole lot. But that's where we're going to head. Elle, how you feeling? You ready for this?
Feels like a challenge to me if I've ever heard it. I'm getting my bows. I'm getting my ribbons all arrayed out. I'm ready.
Oh, man. So good.
Get cracking.
All right. Well, I'm going to start here. When it comes to the story of the conquest, I'm just going to start with a broad statement that probably could be qualified and nuanced, but we don't have archaeological evidence for the conquest during the period when the Bible tells us we should have archaeological evidence. And later on in session 2, we're going to talk about minimalistic and maximalistic scholarship. We're going to talk about these two different ways of viewing history and viewing the biblical record. We're going to pull that apart, but kind of the popular, I wouldn't call it consensus, but kind of the more popular scholastic opinion is that you don't have evidence for this. This isn't a historical conquest. And I know as I say that, there might be a bunch of people that have been like, wait a minute, I've seen a great show on the Discovery Channel. I watched the History Channel and they talked about all the evidence. They showed us all the evidence about the walls of Jericho falling. And I like me a good show on the history of the Discovery Channel, but they're made for entertainment. They're not made for scholarship. And that's not to say that nothing on there is, but oftentimes these things that we're seeing are not necessarily peer-reviewed, what you might be studying in your academic institutions. They're made for something else. I like a good show on the Discovery Channel, but I also love me a good marathon of Finding Bigfoot. I mean, who doesn't, right, Elle?
I haven't seen that one specifically, but I'm sure it's wonderful.
See, I don't have cable at my house. So when I'm at a hotel, I can watch like endless ghost adventures on the Travel Channel for hours on end.
We're learning so much.
I know. I love me some entertainment, but that's what it is. It's like, it's entertainment. Those things do not sit in the same category for my mind or my soul as when I'm reading some good biblical history resource. They're just not the same thing. In fact, Elle, one of the things I love about having you here on the reboot, you did an episode, one of your first episodes you did after joining the team and becoming a co-host with the Bema team. You did a whole episode on archaeology of the conquest in Joshua. I think we can give people a hall pass. We can link that episode in the show notes. But anything you'd say just about either what you just heard me say, counterpoints, or anything you'd share that points people towards that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just scatter my ribbons in the breeze and say, well, but what about? And you can go listen to the episodes. Folks out there can go listen to the episode that I did. And then also by the time this comes out, I've also talked about different stories from Joshua in a much, much later series. However, I also took all of the archaeology classes that were offered in English because I'm not a masochist.
Ooh, okay.
At Hebrew University. And we talked a lot about this particular time period. And there are some fun little things that we can say for sure. Like a bunch of people not from Canaan came across the river and they moved into the land and they had a distinct pottery style and et cetera, et cetera. So when we say that there's no archaeological evidence for the conquest, what you mean is possibly that there's no specific, like the Battle of Ai. We know for sure we have direct datable evidence that says that in this exact year that this happens. But we do have what are called like destruction layers in different cities. We know someone took down the city, and it might not square with exactly all the ways that we would like the dates to exactly line up. But if you're curious about that, go listen to the season 6 episode specifically all on this issue. But yes, I'm going to lean a little bit more on the side of a little bit less skeptical, maybe.
Okay, well, that's good.
That is episode 240, and I guess we're giving a hall pass. I feel like we're getting a little fast and loose with the hall passes, so don't get lost in session 6 if you jump ahead to listen to that. But that is episode 240.
Oh, yeah. If I find you in episode 241, that hall pass is going to get you straight to detention.
Yanked. Absolutely. Also, I wrote a television show for the Discovery Channel, so do I feel a little bit slighted by this shade at the Discovery Channel? Yes, I do.
I didn't even think about that, Elle. That is hilarious. Oh, gosh, that's great.
Alas, Jesus, the sufferings of Christ are with me in this blasphemy, this slander. I'll be able to move on.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate, Elle, you leaning that way, the way you did, because it's a great segue to kind of where I want to head in the next little section, which is how do we pull those two realities together? On one hand, I was told when I was raised, we have apologetic evidence for everything. The Bible is so true. There's evidence for everything. Oh my gosh, everything was literally exactly as it was told. So I started with this sense of like, okay, but we really don't have the evidence we would want to prove these things. Yet we do have these scattered pieces of evidence of pieces of the story. So how do we begin to bring those two things together? And one of the things that I love to think about as I wrestle with this most difficult story in the Bible for me is the idea of conquest narrative. It's a very common genre for the people of the biblical day, and we can wrestle with what that day is. But this biblical part of history, they're used to telling conquest. They erect things like stelas. I think, Brent, in the original episode, you linked a Wikipedia article on stela, which we could link again. Just what is a stela? And it will give examples of what these stelas are. And they often will have plaster on them or have carvings on them that tell the story. And these stories are usually embellished and hyperbolic. I remember one of the stelas that sits in one of the museums that I have visited over in the region has the Sennacherib stela, where he talks about his war against Hezekiah and how he has Hezekiah shut up as a bird in a cage, which, if we give any credence again to the biblical narrative, that's not how that story went. Sennacherib went, scrambling home with his tail between his legs because of a great plague that God sent on his But we tell these conquest narratives in a way that definitely embellish. There are Hittite versions of conquest narratives. There's Pharaoh, when Pharaoh went to war against the Hittites, and he has his version of how that battle and that war went. Because, Brent, I think you said the first time around, who is it that writes history? History is written by the
victors.
And by the victors.
The nerds.
Yes.
Yeah, the victorious nerds.
The nerds working for the victors.
There you go. I like that. That's more accurate. So is this possibly, is the story of Joshua, the narrative of Joshua, is this story using a genre of narrative in a very inspired way, but almost tongue-in-cheek, to make a more poetic point about how they came into the land and how they, quote-unquote, conquered a region for the kingdom of God? And are they telling a literal story of conquest, or are they making a more poetic point? But I'm kind of with Elle, even though it doesn't sound like it up to this point. I don't love to just sit in a world of textual analysis and criticism. I love to lean that way. I love to give that some value. But I prefer to wrestle with the text as written. My fundamentalist roots that I still appreciate, I believe in the inspiration of Scripture. I really do. And by that, I don't mean a literalism. You've picked that up by now, everybody. But I always want to lean generally towards a more straightforward reading as much as I possibly can, at least to begin my study with. So I don't love to just sit back and be like, well, we don't have any evidence, and there's a genre, and I'm just going to conveniently explain this story away, as I've experienced in a lot of my graduate study, and very fashionable in some of those corners. So
Yep.
I love that. I love that yep from Elle. It actually sounds very good to me. Let's see here. There's some resources to consider. I don't know why I give them here, but here's a couple things that we linked the first time around. Greg Boyd had a sermon. Greg Boyd loves to take a very Christocentric, crucicentric, death of the warrior God is one of the resources that he writes about. And he had a sermon we linked years ago. If it's still up, we'll still link it. One of the resources, here comes another Rob Bell resource. Everybody brace yourself. The Whore, the Scandal.
Oh, no.
I actually thought Rob Bell's What is the Bible was a phenomenal book. And one of the things that he dealt with, it's one of my top 5 books, personally. I probably shouldn't have said that on the podcast, but here we are, reboot. I thought one of the things he dealt with in that book really well was the idea of conquest, and how do you frame it? And how do you read about that now as you read this Bible and this book centuries later? So those are just some resources we'll come back to some of those ideas here in a moment. But I would say this episode's kind of a mess, because I'm just kind of like throwing out all the things, all the notes that I have on why this story is so difficult, and inviting Elle to give some of her own thoughts too. But here's my next note. What does God say? What does God not say? First of all, what he says versus what Joshua says he says, I want to pay attention to, because the Bible has no problem, at least in Torah, and I don't think in Joshua, has a problem saying, and the Lord says. That's a very common phrase. And I think of things like Exodus or Numbers, where we're told the Lord said to Moses, and then Exodus is going to take the time to tell us that Moses said exactly what, it doesn't just say, and Moses told the people. It actually has us listening to Moses tell the people what God just told Moses. The Bible has no problem telling us, and the Lord said to Joshua. And the book of Joshua has God speaking to Joshua. Before we're done today, Brent, I'll have you read some of what God says to Joshua. And yet there's an awful lot of Joshua saying what God has said in Joshua. I just want to notice that, because I think that might be worth marinating on. Second, when God does say something in the text, what does he actually say? And Elle, you got another episode. I don't know if it's going to be out by the time, Brent, your fancy spreadsheet timeline, is this episode going to be out by the time this releases? It's going to be close.
No, not even close.
Not even close. Shucks. Well, in the future, for all of you folks that find this episode later, in season 10, Elle has a series she's going to do on Joshua and Judges. And I just got to record it with her, but a few days ago. And Elle, you didn't even know we were talking about this necessarily, but you spoke to a bunch of these things. So can you just give us some of the big ideas? We talked about things like harem and just give us a flyby. You'll talk about it in that episode later, but give us a flyby of that.
1,000-foot view. If you are struggling and like, what does Marty mean? He's talking about using genre, but like it's different, not using genre. What does that look like? let's put flesh on that for just 1 second. So if we read conquest narratives, I'm going to pull from my brain a Neo-Assyrian one about one of their kings. He's like going on this big Alexander the Great-esque like conquering epic. And that story, whenever it has his name, it has all these titles about how amazing and muscular and, conquering and aggressive he is. And it has cool stories in it about how he gets to like a desert and there's all these flaming serpents that he has to defeat, etc. If we jump over to Joshua and we have that genre in our brains, all of a sudden things start standing out to us because the way Joshua as a character is introduced to us is not as, wow, what an incredibly aggressive, amazing warrior. We're introduced to him, the story of Moshe going and talking to God in the tabernacle whenever Moses is freaking out and doesn't know what to do. And it says that Yehoshua, is the guy who is just sitting in the back of the tent all day, all night, because he loves the presence of God. So that's the kind of thing that stands out way more if we have the genre in mind. And that's why knowing the genre is a gift, not like this isn't really true because the genre is just always so extra and over the top. It's a gift because it enables us to hold it up to the text and say, okay, if God is using this genre, what is he saying about the heroes of his story? The heroes of his story are people who love worship and love the presence of God.
Yeah, no, I love that. And one of the other things you talked about in that episode was this idea of like what God actually said. We'll read in our English translations that God says to go destroy or eliminate this group of people. You took a lot of time to look at what is that word that's used in the passage you reference is harem.
Right.
And this harem is not necessarily a word for, we have words for destruction. We have words for destroy. And this word means something else. And that matters. That matters when we read it.
Right. Absolutely. So anytime you come across in your English Bible the word destroy, take a little journey. Search out your concordance because there is a word that means destroy, like Marty said, but there's a lot of words that get translated that way. So look at your concordance. Does it work in all these different spots? So cherem, spoilers, we will leave for the future, but it's the idea of setting something aside. It has to do with consecration and devotion. So super different than the idea of violence. So we have our presuppositions. God orders his people to slaughter people. Oh no, what do we do? And then we delve into theology. If we stay just in the text, not that theology is bad, but if we just stay in the story and dig in a little bit, get some of that dirt under our fingernails, what can we find God might have actually been commanding his people to do?
Yes, absolutely. I'm just going to keep this moving and grab my next random note. My next random note is just about how we've evolved with human consciousness. And this probably requires more commentary than I gave it years ago in the first round. It's worth saying two things. Two things are going to be true at the same time. Number one, the world of Joshua is definitely not the world of us today. They don't have the same experience of the things we value in the world, the way we evaluate culture, our socio-political idolatries. I said idolatries, and I kind of didn't mean it, but I meant it. Our socio-political ideologies are the way that we frame ethics and morality in our world. They framed it differently. Now, we got to be careful because Elle has taught me, since I recorded that episode, of the dangers of what she's called primitivism, where we just think those ancient peoples are so stupid and so barbaric and they have no ethics because they're so dumb and they're just a bunch of animals. And so we can't take that too far. And Elle, I would love for you to comment on this, but their world is different from our world of Twitter and social media and hashtags and the way that we see. And there's nothing wrong with the way we saw justice, but it's definitely different from the way that they communicated similar ideas and similar human experiences.
Absolutely. I think the principle that we want to keep in mind is if we do encounter a presumption that we have, great, write it down and then go do some searching, find out if that presumption is actually true, because sometimes it is, right? If we're going to say, oh, well, back then, violence was the answer for everything. And a lot of warfare, a lot of violence was pretty regular. That's not necessarily wrong. However, if we say our era doesn't have violence,
Sure.
then we're also making some presumptions. So are we really that evolved, or do we just live in neighborhoods and parts of the planet that we see it less with our eyes unless we're on the internet?
It's actually a great example of that because, it's how we frame it. It's how we talk about it. It's how we perceive it and judge it and evaluate it. But we're definitely the same violent humanity today that we have or read about some ancient, barbaric, violent humanity back then.
Right.
That is well said, as a good example. Well, I have a little section of notes here that I call observations. So here's some observations. There's an awful lot of stories where God's pretty quiet. It goes back to the idea I was talking about a little earlier. Joshua does a lot of talking. Joshua does a lot of planning. Joshua does a lot of strategizing. But there's an awful lot of stories where God is quiet. It's an observation that I make. Observation. Joshua acts in some ways. I think I heard Elle saying echoes of this too. Joshua acts like kings of his day. At least we find similar elements. I think of things like in Joshua, we'll read about how Joshua impales the kings that he defeats outside the city gates. Similar to things that we might see from Assyria or different things at other points in history even. And yet, Joshua is also different than the kings of his day on some level. I think of how the story tells us that Joshua takes down the bodies by nightfall. And Deuteronomy, which we just read, the book prior, told folks you have to take down a dead body. You're not allowed to leave a dead body out hanging. It's just so weird because he's doing something that the kings do. And maybe and obviously I can't reference Game of Thrones. But if you were a Game of Thrones fan, which obviously very HBO-y show, so all the disclaimers there.
If you enjoy historical retellings of the War of the Roses that happen to include ice zombies and dragons of a show that shall not be named.
Yeah, there you go. I love that. You saw this in that show where part of what they do is they defeat a king and then they stick the head up on a pole. It's meant to send a message. And you don't take it down at the end of the day, or you're not sending a very good message. You're supposed to leave it up there for the next weeks and months and let it really tell your enemies what happens when you stand against and yet Joshua is putting them on poles, but then taking them down. Like the whole thing it feels weird, but you also feel like Joshua is similar, but Joshua is also very different. In a lot of ways, this Israelite conquest is one of the softest, feels weird to say, but in many ways, it's some of the softest elements of conquest that you might find in other stories from other cultures, perhaps. I think about the story of the Gibeonites. They show up in the middle of the story of Joshua. They entered deceptively into what we've already looked at in session 1 as a suzerain vassal covenant. They make this arrangement. They're like, oh, look at it. We're not from here. We got moldy bread. We got torn clothes. And it's all a setup, and they deceive the Israelites. And so they make this agreement that they're not going to destroy the Gibeonites. But then they find out the deception. In an ancient world, with a suzerain vassal covenant, you deceive the suzerain. You pay the price for deceiving the suzerain. And yet this suzerain, because they're a covenant people with God, they're going to honor their word. It's such an odd, which makes me think, another observation, when I look at the book of Joshua, you've got all these tales of how they conquer cities and but the great stories, like the stories that stand out, the stories that you and I remember because they're the stories of emphasis in Joshua, are stories of redemption, not actual stories of conquest. First of all, there's a theory that Joshua is a chiasm. And I'm not sure I've necessarily decided that I'm totally on board with this theory, but there's a theory that the entire book of Joshua is a chiasm, the center of that chiasm being Joshua 11. And in fact, Brent, if you want to read that little paragraph section of Joshua 11 for us, we can hear it.
So Joshua took this entire land, the hill country, all the Negev, the whole region of Goshen, the western foothills, the Arabah, and the mountains of Israel with their foothills, from Mount Halak, which rises toward Seir to Baal Gad, in the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon. He captured all their kings and put them to death. Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time. Except for the Hivites living in Gibeon, not one city made a treaty of peace with the Israelites, who took them all in battle. For it was the Lord himself who hardened their hearts to wage war against Israel, so that he might destroy them totally, exterminating them without mercy, as the Lord had commanded Moses. At that time Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Anav, from all the hill country in Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive.
Okay, so, man, why did Marty just have Brent read, of all passages out of Joshua, that passage? Well, because according to this chiasm theory, that's the center of the chiasm. And the center of that passage that Brent just read us happens to be the beginning of verse 19a. Give us that first chunk of verse 19, Brent.
Except for the Hivites living in Gibeon, not one city made a treaty of peace with the Israelites.
So listen, if there is credence to this book being a chiasm, and if that were, and I don't know if I'm sold that it is, but if that were the center verse of the entire book of Joshua and this chiastic message, and the center verse in the middle of all the things that they destroyed, the center verse of the entire thing is that, oh, well, they actually didn't defeat these people. What do you do with that little buried treasure in the middle?
That made me wonder, and I still wonder now. Does that mean they actually attempted to make treaties with all of these different people and the people said no? Or did they come to the Israelites and make their own? Like, what was the interaction? Why was it only one, and who did what?
Yeah, and you wonder with the language that's used there if it does suggest that. I know one of my favorite sources for wrestling with this stuff that I haven't mentioned yet is The Source by James Michener. There's a chapter in there where the character during this period of history, it's historical fiction, it's not about biblical characters, but during this period of history, God tells the person to go take the city. And the character is like, you want me to go to war? Like, why would you want me to go to war? And God's like, I didn't say anything about war. I told you to go take the city. So he literally walks up to the gate and essentially knocks on the door and says, God told me I'm supposed to take the city. Will you accept the terms of peace? Now, I'm not suggesting that's exactly what happens historically, but it gets my imagination working in some beautiful ways of perhaps as they engaged during this time, that was their attempt and the people there reacted. It doesn't justify anything or help me sleep at night, but it's a great question.
Can I lean in for a second here?
Yes. I love leaning in.
If this is the center of the chiasm of the whole thing, that's very interesting to me. But something that stands out, or two things that stand out, is if we go back to Exodus 23, God's super clear about what they're supposed to do. God says that he's going to do all of these things, and it doesn't say that they're supposed to be doing anything, except for one thing, which is that they aren't to make any covenants with any of the people because God is moving them out. So it's not necessarily anyway through that interpretive lens that the people have failed because they weren't making peace with all these people and walking the way of Jesus by, loving their neighbor as themselves, but rather that they were successful in not making covenant because the reason that God said that they shouldn't make a covenant is because he was concerned about the gods of the Canaanites becoming, quote, a noose to God's people. And then the other thing from Exodus 23 that I don't think we even talked about in that episode particularly is he has this long stretch being like, do not try to kick everybody out at the same time, or I'm not going to kick everybody out at the same time, because if you do that, you will not be able to steward the land well. And there's this whole thing about what will happen and how challenging it will be if you do try to move everybody out of the land. And so I'm curious if this is the middle that the narrator is documenting. They did a pretty good job not making covenants, except for this one time. They did try to do God's job for him rather than being like King David and waiting for God to move. But because they were trying to do everything in their timing instead of God's timing, they overdid it.
Yep.
They overdid it, and they're going to have some issues from that, which certainly we see into the rest of the story in Judges. The last thing is that word exterminate is challenging. If you look at the literal pictorial meaning, it's to make desolate, which is different than exterminate. I can see how you get from to make desolate to exterminate, but in Exodus 23, God says he's going to drive the people out. That would also make the cities desolate because nobody's caring for it, right? So it's like we made an interpretive choice. That makes some logical sense.
Yep.
But is the actual translation exterminate? I would say that's a little extra and probably filtered through the cultural lens of the translators.
Absolutely. And you see these layers. You see these layers that boy, it makes it. And if we're overwhelmed, I get it can be so frustrating. Like, just make it simple and make it easy. And yet these layers are what bring the wrestling match, I can finally go, wait a minute, there's some complexity here. There's some stuff that I got to figure out how you weave this stuff together. There are ways to frame this and see this and read this and understand this. So yeah, I found the source to be really helpful in helping my fictional imagination based on history work. Another source that I think is of great value personally is The Gifts of the Jews by Thomas Cahill. It starts its story in similar places. Its opening is very, very graphic. Some of its opening chapters. So HBO level, but I found it, maybe it's because of how I engage historical fiction or those kinds of things, but I found it to be super helpful in trying to imagine a world that I think I understand in the abstract and trying to enter into it maybe in a more concrete way. But that's another source. The greater point here being that the stories that seem to rise to the surface, maybe a chiasm here. What about the story of Rahab? This is a story of redemption, of an outsider finding a place, of somebody choosing to say yes to the thing that God's doing, even though they don't belong to God's covenant culture, and they get protected. They get brought in. They find a place of belonging. These are stories of redemption that rise to the surface of the book of Joshua for me. So there is a presentation that you find in the show notes. And at some point, if this starts to get at all too graphic or triggering, like feel free to just duck out and just skip a little forward. But I have found this book of conquest brings up really dramatic, important things. So considering context can be really important too. And I know how I was taught by my teachers, and they asked me to learn more about the culture of the Amorites, the culture of the land of Canaan. What was that culture like? They taught me about these fertility cults. Your first slide there, relatively tasteful for what we're trying to represent here in this photo of these ancient fertility cults. And in the source, Missioner is going to do the same thing for the same period of history. There is this woman, she's pregnant, and in this ancient world, a pregnancy is not necessarily good news. Good chance you die while giving birth. Good chance that birth mortality rates are just, it's a different world, and she's scared. And so there are these fertility cults, these goddesses that if you can appease. And so she's buying these little statues, and her husband is being sent to the temple to sleep with the temple prostitutes because he can make the sexual fertility goddess happy. Then she has a healthy, happy birth. And it's a pretty hard to read chapter, but it helped me understand what this world may have been like. Now, I should probably stop here because since first go around and our reboot, Elle's pointed out, if we're going to be honest about the archaeological evidence that we have for the conquest, or maybe what we don't have for the conquest, it should also be pointed out that the people that taught me are pulling some pieces together. There's some conjecture. We don't necessarily have exact archaeological evidence of sexual fertility cults. We have agricultural fertility. We have the Baal agricultural god type engagement. But Elle, you were saying we lack any, like, we have dolls, we have fertility cults over there, but in the region of the biblical story, in the region of what we call the Levant, we don't have necessarily hard evidence that that's taking place in the land of the Amorites. Is that right?
Right. So we have later accounts, especially biblical accounts of in the Iron Age, which is forward in time, plenty of Asherah poles, right, are the things that people who are familiar with that portion of their scripture will recognize. However, in our archaeological evidence, we have some great compendiums preserved over time, which is crazy and miraculous that we have those. But they describe the rites of how to perform the rituals that they had, that they did practice. And so we can't prove that there weren't priestesses who people were utilizing. However, that idea also fits within the what's called reception history, the idea that commentators have cobbled together over time with some other biases layered in. Ooh, wouldn't it be exciting and interesting if these foreign, far-off peoples had these lascivious rites? Let's write that into our, as you said, fictional renderings.
Right.
And so when we look at what we actually have, we don't necessarily see those specifically. However, that dynamic of being concerned about birth and attempting to try to channel certain divinities that are supposed to protect you. There's a whole hullabaloo that we definitely do see in the archaeological evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good warning and a good, like, if we're going to be honest about archaeology in one direction, we have to be just as honest about the things we wrestle in our own, the things that make us more comfortable. We'll want to be just as honest. Similar, some of the things that we have from that period of history, child sacrifice with the Baals. Everybody had different practices. We don't know exactly what happens in this place or that place at any given exact moment of history. But this idea of child sacrifice that was so rampant in the larger world that Abraham was from, that they rubbed shoulders with, that can be present in places like Canaan. I was taught about baby graveyards with thousands of infant corpses that had been offered to the gods. Elle was telling me that largely centers around a site at Carthage, somewhat contested. But the idea of child sacrifice in the ancient world, a prevalent one, Elle, would you say?
Sure. Yep.
And so part of what I put in that slideshow, the second slide, and this is hard to talk about, so I understand. And yet the gravity of it, I want to resist the urge to be sensational and dramatic, but also consider some things straightforward. The Phoenician Baals would make these bronze statues. I think actually the source has a real, like maybe the hardest part for me to read in the source was the chapter on child sacrifice, where the priests of Baal at different points of history talked about the smile of Baal, and it referred to the grimacing face that the child would make. They would take these statues of a bull, the head of a bull, and the arms of the Baal god outstretched, and they would light a fire inside the idol. It essentially was a furnace. And then you put the child on kind of the glowing, red-hot, burning hands of the statue. And as the child screams, they called it the smile of Baal, as the child slides down the arms and into the belly of the furnace, and they give the child to God. I think that was one of the stories depicted in the source. Unbelievably difficult to read. And the reason I share that is because in some weird way, it helps me, because when I wrestle with this, I don't know how to take a side. I don't know how to take a side when I wrestle with what potentially could have been at play in the conquest. I never want to be okay with genocide. I never want to read stories of conquest straightforward, and they went in and slaughtered people and, tap my Bible and put my bookmark in it and shut it and sleep good that evening. I never want to be okay with that. I want to wrestle with that. I also don't want to be okay with rampant violation of human rights, might be the language we would use today. So on one hand, we say, how can God not do something? We can maybe even relate to this, thinking about things we might look at today. If there's a God, how can a God not do something about this? And then if God shows up to do something, I'm now left with, how could God do this? We wrestle with the conquest, because how could God be behind it? And yet, if we ever find ourselves in a world that we might even say, boy, it feels like it might be time for a little conquest, I'm glad that I don't necessarily have to figure out how to roll these dice. I would not do a very good job at being God. I would not know what it means to be patient or discerning. We continue to see this about God throughout the story of the Hebrew scriptures. I think of books like Jonah we'll look at later. God's unbelievably patient with very brutal empires. We talked in season 1 about 1,000 to 3, referenced it earlier in the episode. 1,000 to 3. When I look at what we could be dealing with, and I can relate to it even in my own world on some level, I don't know. I don't know where I land when it comes time to wait, God, show up and do something, and wait, God, how could you do that? But Elle, any thoughts? I've yammered for a little bit before we move towards a couple passages to close.
Yeah, I just think if there are specific stories that are nagging at you, lean into that provocation from, in my opinion, potentially the Spirit, right? Because we can lean back and kind of numb out with whatever response feels best to us, like, well, they deserved it, or like, well, we're Jesus followers anyway. And I'm not saying any of those takes us particularly wrong, but if we pick a story and then get into it and see, like, what did God say? Is God the one giving the commandment, or is it Joshua? What do these words mean? What is the context? We live in an incredible age of being able to, I hate the phrase, but do your own research, right?
Yeah.
We all have some ability. Wikipedia is an amazing place, a great starting place, right? To like delve into these things because God is in his story. And in my opinion, he is faithful to show up with us and alongside us. Even if all the answers aren't perfect, there's always good fruit that comes from that practice.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we've been doing this wrestling hardest story in the Bible for me nonsense long enough. Let me try to grab two. I want to do two passages to try to pull some beautiful lesson teaching points before we. Brent, read us the first few verses of Joshua chapter 4.
When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight."
Yeah, there's this reference to them crossing the Jordan. They take these stones, and these stones end up becoming what I was taught about. They were called standing stones, my teachers told me. Standing stones, or stones of witness. And these stones were different than, like earlier, we talked about stelas. And it's different than a stela because a stela is going to tell the story. A stela's got plaster on it, or it's got carvings on it. You actually write the story out so you can stand there and look at it kind of like they put it up in a museum. You can actually look at it and read it if you knew how to read the original language. A standing stone or a stone of witness, I believe the Hebrew word masavot, standing stones.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. These masavot in the Hebrew, they're called stones of witness because they don't have writing on it. The stone doesn't do anything if there's nobody there to tell the story. So the stone is supposed to make you go like, what happened here? Dad, what happened here? But Dad has to be there, and Dad has to know what happened here to tell you the story. He has to bear witness. They're stones of witness. And so in the presentation there, you have a photo, and these are stones that are at Tel Gezer. We go there and we take our study tours over to Israel. We go to Tel Gezer, and we get to see these stones. There are 12 stones. Originally, scholars wondered if they were Israelite stones. There just happen to be 12. They are not at the right layer of the Tel to be Israelite. They don't appear to be Israelite in nature at all. But they never had plaster on them. They do not function as stelas. And I don't know why they're standing there because there's nobody there to tell us the story of why those stones are there. But it raises this beautiful, well, there's another example before I move on. Jacob, in the story of Jacob's ladder. Jacob has this dream. He dreams of a ladder going up to heaven, angels ascending, descending. He wakes up. He says, God was in this place the whole time. I wasn't aware of it. And he takes the stone he was resting on and he stands it up and he erects that stone and he pours oil on it and anoints it. But he doesn't write on it. It's a stone of witness. It's a standing stone. In fact, later in Genesis, he comes back to that place with his family, I assume, to visit the stone and to tell the story of where he's been and who this God is and what he's experienced. Which makes me ask the question, do we have one of my teaching points to give us something to feel warm and fuzzy about for our Joshua episode? Do we have standing stones? Do we have standing stones in our own lives, for our own families? What stories do we share with our children or our friends or the folks in our fellowship? We want to have these odd things that remind us of the story of God, not just for ourselves, but in my house, if you were to go over to my work desk, I still have what I had years ago when I recorded the first episode. Out of my desk hangs an old, dirty football belt from my time in high school. I was supposed to turn it in when I turned in my uniform, but I kept the belt. And it has this athletic tape wrapped around it for every single game that we played. And we were pretty close to undefeated. So almost everyone has blue ink where we won and the scores on it. And it's really, but it's this old, grummy, muddy, gross football belt that hangs out of my desk drawer. And if you were to walk by, you'd be like, what is that? And I would have the opportunity to tell the story about who I was back then and what I wanted to do. I wanted to go play football. I was going to go to law school. I was going to go head to Dartmouth University and pursue all my greatest, wildest dreams. And somewhere in the midst of that, God said, I want you to go to Boise Bible College, of all places. That's that's not the same university. Boise Bible College, Dartmouth, not quite the same thing, not the same life path. But I often look at that belt and remember who I thought I was going to be versus who God invited me to become. It's a standing stone. If you were to sit on top of my bookshelves, Well, not if you were to sit on top of my bookshelves, but if you were to look at what sits on my bookshelves, you would see stones and rocks. You'd see an old watch that doesn't work. You'd see a drum from Africa. You'd see a little piece of like tattered canvas. And you'd be like, why are these things sitting on your bookshelves? And I could tell you with any single one of them, the story of what it reminds me of. And usually they are stories of God showing up in my life. So,
I mean, let's try it, Marty. I'm looking at your bookshelf on the Zoom window right now.
Okay.
Over your left shoulder, you've got a little statue, kind of a white, I don't know, marble or whatever it is.
An idol.
What do we have there?
What do we have over a statue over my
that
left
second
shoulder?
shelf?
Oh, yeah, I see it.
From the top.
Oh, gosh. Okay, that's a really bad example. That is not.
Okay, never mind. Give me a different one to point out.
Oh, well, that's just funny. That's my Pope on a rope. It was given to me as a gift by somebody who got irritated at how I would always be reading Catholicism. And so they gave me it's a bar of soap, and they call it the Pope on the rope. It's a bar of soap on a rope. So there you go, Pope on a rope.
How about same second shelf from the top on the other side of the room? You've got like a photo leaning up against the books there.
Oh, yeah. Well, the better shelf you need to go to is the top, Brent. That's where I keep my muss about. The picture frame you got there, it's just my daughter who gave me a frame that says best dad in the world.
She needs to get out more.
You could tell a ton of stories about your daughter.
Absolutely. I also suppose that would be a Stella, best dad in the world. So there you go. It has writing on it.
Okay. All right.
Well, Elle, you got anything to add about standing stones?
Yeah, I think that it's a great practice. I think can look a bunch of different ways. Sometimes we have like verses from the text that are from particular times in our life that continue to minister to us. That's not really the same thing, but
yeah,
it can be a close hand grab for folks. Millennials, boy, oh boy, do they like to make matzevot out of their arms, tattoos. All the millennials I know are coded in the stories of who they are represented in pictures, which is not my particular practice, but I know lots of folks who have. And then my particular practice, I am really interested in tracing what God has been up to in my family line and my ancestors and different ways that he has continued to be faithful and show up and who he's been shaping us communally to be, not just me and my story. And so I have I think I've lost or gotten rid of or given away most of my things that used to be meaningful to me. At some particular time, it stopped really being meaningful to me. Like, I don't know, the champagne cork from my engagement party when I got engaged to George type things. But I do have framed things from like my grandfather who passed away. I have one of his patches that says, "Come follow me" on it with a big sword. And so, yeah, stuff like that. So that my kids can say, "What's that?" And I can talk to them about this is what God has been doing in our family for quite some time. This is the kind of story. How are we going to engage with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. That's beautiful. All right, last one, Brent. We'll get out of here. There is a phrase in the Hebrew. Elle, let's see if I say it correctly. She's never corrected me, but she probably wanted to. Hazak v'chamatz.
Do you want me to correct you?
Absolutely, if I deserve it.
Deserve is an interesting word. It's just, yeah, chazak v'hamatz.
Yeah, okay.
No. Yeah, who knows? Anyway, See, this is why you shouldn't, as soon as you move yourself into the position of judge, God will be like, "Are you sure?"
Yeah.
But I don't like to.
All right. Well, I'm going to say hazak v'chamatz, be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Hazak v'chamatz meod, be strong and very courageous. Brent, I'm going to have you read all of Joshua 1. It's long, but it's worth it. I promise. There's a reason. Go ahead.
After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people, get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. So Joshua ordered the officers of the people, go through the camp and tell the people, get your provisions ready. 3 days from now you will cross the Jordan here to go in and take possession of the land the Lord your God is giving you for your own. But to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, Joshua said, remember the command that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you after he said, the Lord your God will give you rest by giving you this land. Your wives, your children, and your livestock may stay in the land that Moses gave you east of the Jordan, but all your fighting men, ready for battle, must cross over ahead of your fellow Israelites. You are to help them until the Lord gives them rest, as he has done for you, and until they too have taken possession of the land the Lord your God is giving them. After that you may go back and occupy your own land, which Moses the servant of the Lord gave you east of the Jordan toward the sunrise. Then they answered Joshua, whatever you have commanded us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we fully obeyed Moses, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your word and does not obey it, whatever you may command them will be put to death. Only be strong and courageous.
So there's this rabbinical teaching around Joshua chapter 1 that I've always just kind of loved ever since I heard it. And it's this command to be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous. And it's a refrain that the rabbis pointed out were given to all three parties. And in order to do that, I don't know if the rabbis are putting some of the earlier verses in Joshua's lips. I'd have to go check how they're doing that. But the rabbis said, God comes to Joshua and God says to Joshua, Joshua, I need you to be strong and courageous. Here's your instructions. Have I not told you, be strong and courageous? Joshua then turns to the people and says, this is what we got to go do. And you need to be strong and courageous. And the people in turn, in that last paragraph, turn back to Joshua and they say, Joshua, we're with you. Be strong and courageous. And as I think about that, as I wrestle with all these layers of the conquest, when I think about, is this conquest narrative genre? Was it literal history? Is it poetic? Is it trying to say something else? I wonder if in this opening chapter, part of what we may be hearing and part of what we may be learning is that when you have this kind of unity amongst the people of God, when you don't have enemies between the people that are leading and the people that are being led and people fighting against God and everybody blaming it, when you have this kind of unity, it can empower miracles. Not the violent physical conquest of our enemies, but in the story that the Bible might be telling, redeeming the world and restoring shalom to the chaos. When we can encourage each and every one of us, when we can hear the words of God, when we can speak those words of God to others, and when others can speak those words back to us and say, Hazak v'chamatz, it makes me wonder what kind of things are possible. And maybe that is at least one of the things we might learn from the book of Joshua. It's my closing thoughts, guys. I don't know if you have anything else, but there you go.
My tag on closing thought, emetz or ematz, means we translate it courageous or brave, which is good. But sometimes that communicates a kind of emotionality. Usually I'm team emotion over here, but the word means quick feet. So maybe we're not feeling like we're the protagonist that God is calling to put the world back together. Maybe we don't feel like we are really a new creation in Christ who has the ability to do all these things with resurrection power. It doesn't feel like us, but what we can have is feet that are quick to do the word that God has given us to carry out.
And encourage each other to do so. I love it.
Well, I would say as we bring this episode to a close that this is an easy episode either to get bogged down in or to not do anything with at all. And I would say, don't get bogged down. Keep going. Don't get stuck in this episode. We gave you a bunch of resources. We talked about a bunch of future episodes. You can know that those future episodes are there and come back to this later. But if you get stuck here, then you're going to miss out on so much that we have ahead of you on the journey. And so don't get stuck here, but also don't ignore this story. This is one of the best cases for getting into a discussion group, because this is the kind of story that you really need to wrestle with, that you need to chew through with some other listeners, with other believers, with other people in your community. So if you're not in a group already, get something together, because this is exactly the kind of story that we want to wrestle with and figure out what God is having us do with this. But don't get stuck here either. It's the tension that we live in.
Brent, are you telling the people to Hazak v'chamatz?
Yeah, I guess so.
Bam!
I don't want to presume to speak for the Lord or even for Joshua necessarily, but yeah, I'll say that. Sure. So what we do have for links, we will have in the show notes in your podcast app or at bemadiscipleship.com. But I think we've talked enough, so we'll leave it at that for now. Thank you for joining us on the Bema podcast. We'll talk to you again soon.
Hi, I'm Tom Brantner, a Bema listener and a group facilitator in Huron, South Dakota. And here's the prayer from episode 34's companion. God, may we lean in when the stories challenge us, pressing further into our questions. May we not turn our face away from the texts that make us uncomfortable, but seek to know you more. May we create and be standing stones, reminding the world of what you have done, where we have come from, and all that you have taught us. May we not look away, but be strong and courageous, quick to do the work you've given us to carry out, and encourage others to join us along the journey, even if we don't see the full picture. Amen.